I will talk about privacy by design web applications. And what I hope to do is to give you some context why the question I raise in the subtitle might be important and share what insights I have come up with so far. Let's start by looking at some of the currently successful internet businesses and concepts. I assume all of these logos will look familiar. This is a selection I picked to demonstrate different business models. Many of the recent successes offer their services for free to the end user. In fact, all of these except Amazon and Apple offer free services or products. But probably all of us present here today will agree that there is no free ice cream, especially not when multi-billion-dollar corporations think business. But in fact, no product or service is truly free. Resources are needed for its creation, its maintenance and development. And companies typically exist to make a profit. So when creating a business model, you give a lot of thought to where the money is going to come from. After the .com death, we have witnessed a creeping erosion of privacy on the internet, especially with the rise of the free service business model. Many, if not most interactions, are now coupled with user identification instead of just authentication. And that is not because it is necessary for the respective service to work, but because it is easy to do so and people have gotten quite used to it. Now the resulting user profiles, consisting of primary data like address, gender, email, anything you fill in forms really, but also secondary data like your social graph, your likes and dislikes, behavioral patterns, are the assets deriving from that. And that data is worth a lot. Most of all, but not only to advertisers. The big twist with this business model is that the users of such services are no longer the customers. They are, in fact, the product. The advertisers are the customers. And mechanisms that protect the interest of a user in a typical customer relationship do no longer apply. Market forces, if they work at all, govern this relationship in the interest of the customer and never in the interest of the product. The thesis, privacy is dead, get over it, has been around for more than a decade now and received a lot of reiteration recently, not least, of course, because of the now predominant business model of free services. In a nutshell, it proposes that the loss of privacy is the inevitable consequence of our technological advance. So there's an increasing amount of evangelists of the post-privacy era. Among the most famous quotes are those of Eric Schmidt, at that time CEO of Google, with this peculiar advice regarding our privacy, and of Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook. Both quotes are attempts to declare the lack of privacy to be a new social norm. I personally find this earlier quote from Zuckerberg puts that nicely into perspective. But as Bruce Schneier already observed, it is the very companies whose CEOs eulogize privacy that make their money by controlling vast amounts of their users' information. As an antithesis to post-privacy, we have the Declaration of Universal Human Rights. Privacy is a universal human right, derived from the dignity of man, which is essential for a life and liberty. And there's no way we would ever let that die, one should think. Why is it so important that we consider it an inalienable human right? Answering that in sufficient detail would go way beyond my time scope here, but just think of activists and dissidents for a moment. To them, lack of privacy might turn out to be life-threatening. And history tells us that today's upright citizens may well be tomorrow's dissidents. So clearly, we have a dilemma. The brave new world of post-privacy with its free services, on one hand, and an ever-increasing list of failures of data protection, of identity theft, of extensive surveillance, on the other. And we cannot trust market forces to solve this dilemma for us, since the customers in the scenario, the advertisers, aren't really unhappy. There have been several studies showing that users would be willing to pay for privacy. But in my opinion, that is the wrong approach. Users should be willing to pay for the services they want to use, and they should be able to make an informed decision about the currency they will use to pay. If you want a product or service to respect your privacy, you'll need to be given the choice to pay in some currency other than data. What then is a potential business model for privacy by design? Let's have a look once more at our selection of successful corporations, and let's see how their respective business models work. First of all, this is meant to give you a perspective of how much money is involved. And as you can see, I've also included non-profit organizations like Mozilla and Wikipedia, which incidentally is the source for most of these numbers. And of course, numbers for market capitalization are outdated the moment you print them. And in cases of Facebook, Twitter, Wikipedia, they were estimates to begin with. So please take those with a pinch of salt. Now in this diagram, I try to categorize what their respective business model is based on. And while most of the rising stars are generating their revenue from advertisement, I find it particularly noteworthy that the most successful of them all, currently that is Apple, is very much relying on the old-fashioned way of selling goods, also virtual goods of course, for money. Now here's how that translates into what actually generates the revenue. I think it is obvious that any approach that means to respect the user's privacy implicitly will automatically collide with any business model generating revenue from the user's data. I think the two are mutually exclusive. So the revenue for a privacy by design business model must by necessity come from either charging a fee or from donations. Those of you with keen eyes will have spotted a new logo in this graph. I took the liberty to incorporate PIDA, my own product, to demonstrate where privacy by design applications are located in this diagram. But back to the business model for privacy by design. If the viral factor of the application is high, a freemium model is the most promising approach. For those of you not familiar with the concept, this consists of a base edition free of charge and a premium edition with additional functionality or value that the users pay for. In this model, the premium users implicitly pay for the free riders. And the free riders are not useless though, since it is them that make it viral in the first place. And since the conversion rate of that model is typically about 1%, so 1 in 100 users will go for the premium edition, you really need a critical mass to get this rolling. You need lots and lots of users. So if your model isn't that viral, try to address the intended target market directly with a premium model. But what then constitutes privacy by design? First of all, and very importantly, the right policy. Make sure that your users are in fact your customers. I think this sentence cannot be stressed enough. And let your policy clearly reflect that, by telling your users that you have no commercial interest in their data whatsoever. Users must remain in control of their own data. That is what privacy is all about. And this also means that every user should be able to easily export or remove permanently every bit of their own data from the application whenever they want. The decision what part of their data is confidential and what isn't must be ultimately up to the user. Since a service provider cannot ever decide that for their users, it is their job to treat all of it confidentially. The topic of pseudonyms has been hotly discussed recently in the context of both Facebook's and Google+'s clear name policy. A privacy by design application should of course ask as little mandatory data as possible from its users. Anonymous access is an additional bonus here. Again, think of activists and dissidents. You enter a contract with your users when offering them a service or product. And when privacy is a unique selling point, make it legally binding and make sure you inform your users about it. While using the right policy will give your users the sense that you are willing to treat them as customers and respect their privacy implicitly, using the right technology will go a long way to make sure that there is no easy way to abuse that policy. Wherever possible, set the default values to maximum privacy. Users rarely change the defaults, and that way, users will only set it to less private settings when it really benefits them. And of course, also with privacy by design applications, all privacy measures ultimately depend on how secure the access to the data is. And typically, the user is the weakest link by choosing a weak password. So encourage your users to use strong passphrases instead. And from the technological point of view, support them by offering the use of key files, one-time passphrases, two-factor authentications, and things like that. Any privacy by design application should use SSL-only pages, best with extended validation certificates. And even though SSL is arguably a flawed design, as we've seen from the recent impacts, it is still the best we have to offer right now in terms of transport data security and protection against man-in-the-middle attacks. So your policy states that you have no commercial interest in the user data. Implementing a host-proof approach can make sure you do not know that data in the first place. And that, in my opinion, is the crucial point to truly designing and coding privacy into an application. The key to that is to encrypt the data. And encrypt it already before it is transported and stored on the servers. And that means already within the client and in a web-based application within the web browser. For that encryption to be trustworthy at all, it needs to be open source. So even if all the rest of the application is closed source, everything dealing with encryption needs to be open source so it can be inspected and tested by independent third parties. So for the remainder of my presentation, let me go into the more nerdy details a bit to demonstrate how this can be achieved. I promise it won't be too technical, but I'm open to discuss the technical details in the Q&A. Let's consider a web-based application with the three actors Alice, Bob and Dave. Since it is web-based, it doesn't really matter where they are located, as long as they have internet access. Now in my example, Alice wants to share data confidentially and securely with Bob and Dave. To that end, she classifies the respective data's confidentiality and each recipient's level of clearance. Let's assume one bit of information is classified secret, the other bit top secret. After this classification by Alice, the application will then automatically encrypt the data accordingly with an asymmetric algorithm like RSA. And only after encryption within the browser will the data be sent to the server, using an encrypted transport layer. As a consequence, there is no clear text data on the server. And what's more, also there are no keys on the server to decrypt that data. And that is the principle of a host-proof design. Now we look at the situation from Bob's perspective. Alice has decided that Bob may see information up to the confidentiality secret, and in particular that does not include the top secret data. So the application makes sure that information Bob isn't authorized to see will not be delivered to him in the first place. And what's more, Bob only has the key to decrypt data for his level of confidentiality. So even if he or a hacker could trick the application to deliver that data, it would be of no use, since it cannot be decrypted. Again, also decryption only happens on the client side, that is, in the browser. So what about the role of the server? Well, it provides the public key infrastructure for the asymmetric encryption and distributes both the logs and the encrypted data. Again, it does not store the keys for decryption. Now let's look at the situation from Dave's perspective. Alice decided that Dave may see information up to the confidentiality top secret, which includes all data of lesser confidentiality. So both pieces of information are delivered, and what's more, Dave's key will enable him to decrypt both. Of course, there does not need to be a one-way communication as the arrows might suggest. The same principles can be applied in all directions. Furthermore, the classification into secret and top secret is arbitrary. That might just as well read business partners, friends, family, or whatever classification the users themselves define. An application can be designed to incorporate as many levels of confidentiality as you consider necessary for your service. Google's circles help to introduce this concept to a wider public, sadly, of course, both without the encryption and without the privacy policy to go along with it. And to be fair, Diaspora's concept of aspects was around before that, and without wanting to brag, Peter's concept of trust levels was there even earlier. I hope I was able to demonstrate that with the technology we have at hand, and with using the right policy, it is very well possible to create privacy by design applications and services. If they can be economically successful, strongly depends on whether enough users are willing to use and pay for such services, given the current misconception that there is an alternative of free services. So thanks from Alice and Bob, Dave and me for your attention, and I will leave you with this quote from Dana Boyd.